All right. Thanks so much for joining us today, Claire, for the Q2 podcast. We're really happy to have you. And,
thanks for having me.
Thanks for opening up your office on this rainy day, but we made it out. We made it okay. I wanted to jump in, before we jump into the questions, learn more about your background, have our audience members learn more about your journey of how you came to your current position in UPenn and some of the, lessons you learned along the way and you're becoming at your place of position right now.
Sure. So it's funny that I'm at UPenn now because I started my career at UPenn in college. Mm-hmm. I graduated from college in 2004 and I was an urban studies major, and I really thought that I would work primarily on urban community renewal, and so I wrote my senior thesis on the Neighborhood Transformation Initiative, which was Mayor Street's policy to redesign urban communities. And I spent a lot of time in neighborhoods talking to residents about the kind of changes that they wanted to see in their neighborhoods. And I asked one question of all residents. I said, if you had a magic wand and you could really fix one problem in your community, what would you fix and why? And I expected to get a range of responses, but every single person I talked to, upwards of 100 people, said education. And so I thought, well, maybe this focus on community development I'm doing, not that it's a bad focus, it's really important work. Maybe there's something in education that I should really be paying more attention to. And so my senior year, I made a big shift in my thinking of what I wanted to do and joined Teach for America, which is a program you may be familiar with, and went back to Texas, where I'm from, and I taught third grade for 2 years. And the experience that I had in the classroom is what ultimately propelled me to where I am now. And I could talk a lot about stories from the classroom, but I really took a couple of things away from that continue to really drive my thinking in the work that I do today. The first is that, without question, teaching is the most challenging job that there is. We don't do nearly enough to recognize or support educators. And you're nodding your head, and so people recognize that on some level, but there's this experience you have when you're in the classroom where it's just an incredibly challenging and rewarding profession, but we don't do nearly enough to support or recognize teachers. But what I also realized when I was in the classroom was that teachers could have an incredible impact on how much students learned. So despite everything happening out there, all of the challenges at the policy level or in the neighborhood that I taught in, if I came to school and taught well and had good instruction, my students learned. And so I taught third grade and saw students that started my class not reading, end my class reading. And that's that special year in third grade where you can see a tremendous amount of progress. So while recognizing that teaching was really hard and we weren't doing enough to support teachers, what I also recognized was that teachers had such an incredible opportunity to really impact the lives of kids. And that's why it's so important that we do more to support them. So I had this sort of paradox in some ways of teaching is so incredibly important, but yet we don't have the environments that we need to help teachers be successful. And so that's what's really driven me back into the work that I do now at Penn. I'm a researcher. But researcher comes with a certain connotation that's, and particularly at a university like Penn, people think ivory tower, sort of separated from the community. But I'm very passionate about translational research. So I work for a center at Penn that's focused on doing translational research with districts, states, networks of charter schools on how do they recruit, support, and retain highly effective teachers in the schools that need them the most. And so that's really been sort of my pathway, is really driven a lot from my own personal experience in the classroom.
So can you elaborate a little more about the transitional piece? What you mean? Placement?
Translational research. So for, a lot of research in the academic community it's very well done research. It's very rigorous, but it doesn't get out to the people that actually need to use it. So if you go ask policymakers or principals or teachers if they've read a lot of the research work that's coming out of the education community, most would probably say no. They're not familiar with what are some really well-done, cutting-edge studies that are being done, because research world lives sort of here. Then you have policymakers that exist here, and then you have practitioners like teachers and leaders that are doing the work every day, and they live here. And so there's this disconnect between the world of research, the world of policy, and the world of practice. And that, to me, is a really troublesome disconnect. The work that I do now tries to bridge that disconnect. So we do research, but we work with practitioners and we work with policymakers to talk about how that research can actually be applied in a real-world context to make an impact for teachers and kids.
That's really awesome, because we're really big on trying to help our audience members connect the dots to really truly be effective, and that's one of them. So it sounds like does it have the advocacy component to it? Because it sounds like it if you're talking to policy makers and whatnot.
Not necessarily advocacy as you traditionally think of advocacy. I think that policy isn't informed with good information. So we are equipping policymakers with quality information to make their decisions. So in some ways it may be influencing changes in policy, but we're less involved in the advocacy space per se. It's more how can we get research into the hands of the people that need to make the decisions so that the decisions that they ultimately make are informed.
Okay, so typically walk us through, like, who are those people who make those decisions? Is it in the district or is it in, Washington or what?
Sure. So there's a couple. I'll give you an example of some different projects that we're working on now. We're working with the Delaware Department of Education, which is the state Department of Education. So we work with leadership at the state level, and we are evaluating the impact of a program that they have called the Delaware Talent Co-op, which is a program that gives teachers up to $20,000 bonus to either go to or stay in teaching in a high-need school. And we are working with them to evaluate the impact of that program.
Gotcha.
So we interview teachers, we do survey research, we do a number of different things, and then we report back and work collaboratively with the State Department of Education to say, based on what we're learning, how can you improve this program to better meet the needs of teachers? So that would look like the same on a district level or state level. We also do school-based work. So we've worked with principals of single standing schools or networks of schools to say, and that's a little bit more granular than the state policy level, how can we support you to develop new policies and practices based on the needs of your school to actually, again, move the needle on outcomes for teachers and students.
That's
so we've
awesome.
done some state level work, but also in Philly worked with some schools, Frary Charter School, as example, Independence Mission Schools. I'm on the board of Russell Byers Charter School, so I've done a lot of work at that school level also.
Okay, and all this information that you're learning, is it accessible for anyone to pick up and take a look at, or where's that? How is that being used and stored right now for others to take a look at?
So our website's operationpubliced.org, and so we do put up information, case study research from work that we've done. Some of the more recent projects aren't on there yet, but they certainly will be as they get finalized, because I think, to your point, it's not just about working directly with a specific client, but how you're building the base of knowledge more broadly for people that aren't necessarily
being exposed to that in normal places. That's great. That sounds pretty awesome job.
I like it.
Because you're right. You're working at different places of influence, local and at higher levels. You're with what you see now, because you're seeing different things, different perspectives in your capacity right now. As a whole, though, America is still kind of trailing behind, and you would think we'll be in the top 1-3 at least in education, but yet we're pretty low compared to other industrialized, countries. All this awesome stuff we're learning. In the past 5 years, have you seen the needle move to kind of help us jump up a little bit? There's a number of different international studies, comparisons that you're referencing. The PISA study has been done, the TIMS study. There's also locally the NAEP, which is not Philly locally, but locally to our country. So a number of different tests that are done to sort of track progress over time, and you have seen slight increases in the performance of U.S. students, but generally speaking, the trend that you're talking about is still there. There's some variation depending on states, and different communities may be seeing some more of an increase compared to others, but generally speaking, we have not seen the kind of increase that we'd like to in terms of the performance of U.S. students nationwide. Yeah, and you would think in the information age, we should be killing it right now, at least making better strides, but it's not always that simple. It's not always that is easier to say than to actually do it. What do you think are some of the things that hold us back from making those strides? Change is
really hard, and our school system has been structured I wouldn't say the exact same way, but it hasn't changed a lot in the past century in terms of how it's set up and structured. And so and that's because changing it is there's a whole lot of stakeholders
Yeah.
that are invested in the way that the system currently is set up that sort of holds us back. I will say a lot of the debate in education is around the influence of out-of-school factors and in-school factors. My perspective is that both are important, and they're certainly not mutually exclusive.
Exactly.
So the out-of-school factors are to say that why are urban youth, generally the U.S. isn't performing well across areas, but particularly in urban communities. Why is that? And a lot of folks will say, well, it's because of the challenges of poverty. Well, of course, absolutely, we need to do more work to address issues of poverty, healthcare, and community development. Some of the work I did when I was in college, that's very important. But that doesn't mean that in-school influences aren't critically important as well. So the quality of instruction, if you sort of blow away all of the smoke, like what helps students learn, it's the quality of instruction. And so the question is, how do we, on these in-school factors, maximize the quality of instruction that students get? And so there's a number of things I think that can go into that. And if you look at successful schools where kids are sort of defying the odds, you'll see these things in those schools. It's a strong instructional vision, and it doesn't have to be the same instructional vision, but something that's really a strong guiding philosophy, a quality leader that sets the vision and provides the support for his staff.
When you say leader, are you thinking about the principal?
Well, that's a good question. So I think leadership starts at the principal, but what good leaders do is distribute that leadership among their staff. So no one individual. The job of teaching is really hard. Had I been a principal, I might have told you that might have been the other job that could have been harder than teaching, just because so much is asked of one individual. So good principals figure out how to differentiate their support but also distribute their leadership among their staff. So not just the principal, but the leadership in general within a building. Then committed staff. So if you look at schools that have been successful, they've had, maybe not all the staff are still there, but a committed core of staff that stay there and are sort of, they keep the instructional vision strong. And then you have to provide staff with the environment that they need to be successful. So the kind of autonomy that they need to make decisions and be flexible with their students' needs, the kind of data that they need to make informed decisions about what their students need, the kind of resources and support. And then I would say finally, parent and family involvement is also really important. So I say it's the quality of the instruction, but parents and families can support teachers and also reinforce instruction that happens in the classroom and out of school time. So I'd say, vision, leaders, teachers, that environment for teachers to be successful, and then family, sort of broader family and community support. And none of those are a silver bullet in and of themselves, and none of them are really probably all that surprising. I think most people could agree that those things are really important, but we haven't been able to execute those things in schools at scale.
Well, that's a really heart of what we do at PanVisio, is to zero in on what holds back execution, because you have the greatest strategy. You just painted a picture that's a tall order, but it could be done. And for the most part, we've known that for a while, what the elements are, but the execution is so damn hard. You talked about the structure of education being pretty much the same for many years, but then you also said something that teachers might need more autonomy, more creative control. Can you share with us some of the irony of that when we talk about unions and the curriculum and textbooks and teachers who are kind of like sometimes feel hijacked, or not hijacked, but they have to teach a certain way because they're training for a test or preparing them for a test and that kind of thing. Because that's from what I've seen, that tends to be one of the biggest roadblocks in creating this utopia for educational experience that makes students overcome the odds, especially in urban areas.
Yeah, so there's a professor that I've done some work with at Penn, actually, named Richard Ingersoll, wrote a book called Who Controls Teachers' Work? And he would support exactly what you just said. What he found is that what leads to teacher retention, sort of not just of all teachers, but particularly of your highly effective teachers, reporting that they have more control and autonomy over their work. It's not just teachers. There's motivation. A lot of the research I've done has been in motivational theory. So I've done some work with psychology professors here. We're all more motivated when we have more autonomy and control over our work. It's one of the key pillars of intrinsic motivation. So absolutely we have to find a way to give teachers more autonomy and control. I think the challenge is we've always been in an input-driven system. So you mentioned some outcomes, which I can get to in a minute, like test scores and things like that. But generally speaking, the way that we structure and sort of structure teachers' work is by structuring the inputs. So we structure curriculum, and we say, here's the curriculum you need to teach. Here's the schedule you need to teach. Here's the tests you need to give. Everything is really input-based, and that has largely been the way that we've structured education, for the past couple of centuries. What I would like to see is a shift, thoughtful shift, because there's ways to do this wrong, but to more of an outcomes-based system in education where you say, we have certain expectations on the outcome side, and I don't think they can just be test scores, but that could be a part of it. But like, what are the outcomes we want to see in schools? And then we don't care. I mean, we care a little, but we don't generally care as much about how you get there. So here's sort of the end game, and we want to work towards those high expectations and that end game, but we want to allow you more autonomy and flexibility to get to that end goal in the way that works for you, that works for your students, that works for your community. So that kind of flexibility is really important. I think that flexibility absent some sort of outcome is not desirable. So just saying we do away with all expectations and people can just do whatever they want and choose whatever curriculum they want, whatever standards, et cetera, would be a risky proposition. But if there were like agreed upon outcomes that teachers had input into that people were working towards, then giving people more flexibility. And I do think you see that at some of the most successful schools in our country, whether or not
Name them. Do you know?
Sure. So they could be
kicking butt right now.
So they could be. So this is one of the big controversies. People say it's the charter schools. It's not just high performing. There are some high performing charter schools, but there are some really high performing district schools as well. So even in Philadelphia, for example, I'd say, well, I'm biased. I'm on the board of Russell Byers Charter School, but we're also a very high performing charter school. There's some networks of charter schools in Philly, like the Mastery Charter Schools. Or Wissahickon or Independence Charter School. So there's a number of charter schools that are successful. There's also a lot of district schools that have had a lot of success as well. And what's interesting that I'll say is that the district right now in Philadelphia is committed to creating more innovative types of school models. So they opened a number of innovative high schools in the past year. Building 21 is one of the new high schools. Student Science Leadership Academy has been around for years, SLA, and that's a district school, doing some really interesting things with students. So those schools do provide, I'd say across the board, a lot more flexibility and autonomy for teachers, but they have a strong instructional vision and and a clear idea of what they're working towards. So again, it's not whatever you want to do. It's like we have a vision and strong leadership that's going to ensure that people are pushing towards that vision, but they recognize and value the inputs of local educators also.
Yeah, I think that's really important because I think you're right in the sense that if we create a platform that they can kind of, whether it's modular, that could allow that flexibility but still have some type of like platform or systematic, cohesion, that could be really powerful. I do see it in other segments of even business. And I do bring this up a lot sometimes. Like there's some parallels between business practices and how that can really benefit some of the nonprofit sector, government sector, education sector even, where if you do give that autonomy, a lot of good things can happen. But it has to have almost like when you're bowling, the bumper, what's it called? The things on the side. The bumpers. Bumpers, right?
I can only bowl with bumpers. So I'm not a good bowler.
And it's like, it's almost like a fail-safe. Yeah. Don't go outside this range, but you can play here and you can succeed there. Especially for PanVisio, we service nonprofits that meet the needs of families and youth in education. Is this something that's an upcoming type of methodology? Is it always been around for a while, just not executed? Where does it stand right now? And how can we take it into more mainstream to test it out some more so we can see, all right, this does actually work. We need more of this.
So it's certainly been around for a while in terms of it's this autonomy question. So there's always been, it's been, people have been researching and talking about what more autonomy could look like. And New York is an interesting example. If you look at education reform in New York over the years. They've sort of gone to a really standardized approach, and then back to a high levels of autonomy, and then back to a standardized approach. And so I think there's a happy medium, and part of the issue is that oftentimes when autonomy has been implemented, it has been implemented in the way I just described, where it's autonomy. And that's not desirable. There's some level of expectation and standardization that's sort of necessary in education. So I think that's a really tricky balance. I will say that there is more energy around it locally now. Dr. Haidt, just in Philadelphia, Dr. Haidt just released Action Plan 3.0. Part of Action Plan 3.0 is to say, and it just got released literally 2 weeks ago, so we're still learning a little more about what this would actually look like. But a part of Action Plan 3.0 says they want to provide more autonomy for strong leaders and strong schools to make more innovative decisions. And so it'll be interesting to see what that looks like and how that plays out.
Okay, so we had it for a while. No one's been really executing well enough to say, all right, this is the place that we should spend more resources and go. No one has really exemplified this.
So I think here's the challenge. Autonomy works when you have strong leadership. So if you have, think about, I don't know how many principals there are in Philadelphia schools, a couple hundred principals in Philadelphia schools. If those leaders are strong and they have a vision, all the things I described, they have a vision, they know how to delegate responsibility, they have the experience to know how to make decisions and operate like a budget and learn from that, really be an autonomous organization, then those are the kinds of leaders that will really thrive in an autonomous environment. If you have some other leaders, and we certainly do in Philadelphia, I don't know them, so I can name them, but there's without question, there are some leaders that, for whatever reason, really are struggling as principals in schools. And so providing them with autonomy, they may not even want autonomy. They may want more structure as protection. So, and then some may want it, but not have any idea what to do with it. So much of this goes back to the quality. Again, the structural issues are important, but a lot of it goes back to, well, who are the quality leaders that are going to be able to capitalize on this? And if you look at some of the district schools I mentioned or charter schools that I mentioned, and you walk into that school, they are able to execute with more autonomy. Why? I would argue because they have really good leadership. All those other things, they have really good leadership. So autonomy alone is not going to move the needle. It has to be autonomy coupled with ensuring that you have quality leadership and you have the kind of foundation. So there's some folks that have said, researchers and others that have said, you have to earn your autonomy. And there are others that say you should be given autonomy, and then if you don't know how to execute it, we sort of move you back down to more standardization. So there's different perspectives out there, but the question really to me is, how do you provide the leaders with the skill set that they need to know how to take advantage of the autonomy they're provided?
To take it back to the flip side of the structure piece, probably the documentary Waiting for Superman made things so much more difficult for a lot of teachers and a lot of educational leaders. And they definitely painted a really tough picture for unions. When we talk about these holdups and updating or advancing the structure in education, union often comes up. I wanted to ask you, what are some of the myths that people have that are about the unions or about the structure in general that hold the education system back, and what are the legitimate concerns about the unions hold on the educational process and experience?
Sure, and that's a good time to ask that question, because this is also relates to this issue of standardization versus autonomy. So I think it's important. I won't spend a lot of time here, but I do think it's important to have some understanding of why unions came to be. And so there was a lot of discrimination, sort of gender discrimination, racial discrimination. If you were a high school teacher, you made more money than an elementary school teacher, a male teacher compared to a female teacher. There was a lot of discrimination that happened that unions in general, but teachers unions were responding to. Exactly. And so they served an incredibly important purpose. Historically, to really ensure that teachers were being treated fairly as workers, salaries, benefits, working conditions. There was some real exploitation. And so unions have had this very important role that often gets overlooked in the sort of current debate about unions that I think is really important to start with. Because I think that some people are afraid, when we talk about getting rid of unions, are afraid of, well, what was the world like before there were strong unions?
People forget easily.
And do we have the trust that these kinds of things wouldn't happen again? So that's just one thing I'll say sort of as context to understand why unions came to be and why they're so important. But teachers' unions operate as an industrial union. Not everywhere, but in most places. And so what that means is that they negotiate a standardized system for all employees. It's a single salary schedule, so employees are paid based on years of experience. So that's a standard that's equally applied, again, to get back to what some of the discriminatory practices have been. They negotiate benefits. They negotiate standardized working conditions.
Yeah.
And so when you talk about how do we move to autonomy and flexibility and giving leaders more flexibility at their local level to be able to make decisions about what's best for their school, the standardization of union contracts does get in the way of that. It's not to say that there's not a workable solution, but I think that the sort of traditional union practices, the standardization, are at odds with a more flexible approach. So principals, typically don't have the kind of autonomy that they might want to hire and fire or to make certain kinds of decisions or to determine how much to pay their teachers. Now, you could argue, should they or should they not? But that is the standardization versus autonomy piece. So unions have largely had this industrial role. What I will say, so that's not a myth, that's true. But what I will say is that there are some efforts across the country to help unions move to more of to expand their role to also tackle some professional issues, which means things like what roles could unions play in negotiating curriculum? What roles could unions play in helping determine assessments? What role could unions play in helping to design alternate compensation systems or evaluation systems? And that professional unionism, for me, that is personally what I've written some about it, and that's what I'm really excited to see. I don't think we can do away with unions. Well, some people do. I certainly don't. I think they serve a really important role, but the challenge is how can you expand that role so that they don't just tackle the traditional industrial issues, but they take on an expanded role in helping to negotiate the things that I think that are starting to matter more and more to teachers. Not that they haven't mattered before, but particularly with the younger generation of teachers, I think mean a lot more. Yeah, well, a lot of times they're very busy fighting some good fights, and so it's hard to dedicate extra resources or extra time. And it sounds like what teachers' unions could be doing is tapping into what you do and really funneling some of that information and seeing how we can use that as a nationwide, almost think tank of what we can learn from those types of things that's going on in education. It's so interesting, though, that it's because of the standardization, because they're kind of having that hold on what can and can't happen. You talked about the principal or leaders in the area having a vision. They can have a vision, but that might come up against some of the things that they're trying to enforce, and then that's where it gets so troubling for me, because again, from our higher ed background, we catch students at a pre-freshman level or a freshman level in higher ed, and sometimes at schools in the urban districts, not all but some. We have to help them play catch up. That's where the summer bridge programs are really awesome. They've really been studies shown to be super effective, and even first year retention. But again, I would love to see a world, and we talked about this in a previous podcast. I would love to see a world where higher ed can really come alongside some of the educational experiences in high schools and kind of help with that pipeline. But it sounds like I don't hear enough of that position that you hold, that they can help with the professionalism. What's the term that you use for it? Professional unionism.
Yeah, there we go. That's It's sad that in my years in education, this is the first time I'm hearing this angle of it, because all we hear is the bipolar extremes of all union every day, all day, and then anti-union every day, all day. And it's so sad that we don't have something in the middle ground. Who are some of the people besides yourself who are allowing this type of a different take on professional unionism to become more of a reality? Because I don't hear it and I don't see it, and I would love to see more about it.
So you don't hear a lot about it in the Philadelphia area because it's not the approach of the local union. And I should say just one thing, that professional unionism actually requires management and unions, both sides, management and labor, to do things differently. I think you mentioned waiting for Superman before, and I think it characterized some of the challenges around unions, but it put them solely in the camp of all the unions, when really people forget that it's management and labor that negotiate this relationship. And so it's on both sides of it. Both sides of it. You need union leaders and leaders on the district or management side that are committed to a different way of doing business. There is a national organization called TURN, the Teachers Union Reform Network, and their membership has shifted over time, but they are a organization of unions that are more reform-oriented, that have been
more progressive,
and more likely to take on a professional union type approach.
Bingo. Okay.
So in TURN and sort of some other unions, it's funny, there's a number of them in Ohio, Toledo, Columbus, Ohio, Rochester, New York, Montgomery County, Maryland. There are a handful of unions across the country that have had a different, again, unions in management that have had a different kind of working relationship and designed a different way of doing business, certainly hard and challenging work. And I would say that, so I did some research into how they were able to set up those practices, and there's more to be said on some of the specifics, but really, again, so much of it comes down to leadership and stable leadership over time, because these things require trust. So why is change so hard? Why are people so dug in on either side of the issue, as you described? Is because trust has completely broken down. And so it's unrealistic, I think, to assume that a new leader would come into a city like Philadelphia or any other, district for that example, and in the first or second year be able to change a whole lot. They have to spend some time learning and building relationships. But in Philly, we have this churn of superintendents. We get a new one every 3 years, and so they don't have the time to really build the relationship. I don't envy the superintendent in Philadelphia Public Schools. It's incredibly challenging. I mean, look what when Dr. Haidt came in, look what he inherited. He inherited financial crisis, the reality of, well, some would argue whether or not this needed to happen, but the recommendation that, dozens of schools needed to be closed, a community that felt very attacked, teachers that weren't given the kind of resources they need, and then he walks in. I mean, and he's still here, and I believe he is going to be committed to staying here for longer. So I think that I'm hopeful that he'll be the kind of leader that we need to build those relationships, because that's certainly what he spent a lot of the first couple of years he was here doing, was trying to get himself more integrated into the Philadelphia education community. But it's a challenging job, and there's a lot of politics involved in it. So some people leave on their own volition, and others have been asked to leave because of, well, in Philly, a whole range of issues. But it's not just Philly, it's across the country. You have this churn of leadership. And so it's very hard to develop those relationships, I think, that would require a professional union model to take hold, because the union really does not trust the administration.
Got it. So if they wanted to see progress, you got to see good faith on both sides to really earn that trust.
And over time. And I think and this isn't just education or just Philly, but I think we're always waiting for the kind of the big macro change. And I'm more of the mind that small victories and small wins over time lead to big macro change. And what I'd like to see is there something that the union and management in Philadelphia could agree on and get behind the same thing? Maybe it's not the full contract, but start with something that is a win, that demonstrates some trust and commitment to something that they both value, and then move on to something bigger over time, because it's the bigger policy level change is really daunting when trust is broken down. I think we need some smaller victories to rebuild the trust in Philadelphia education.
Yeah, I think also when we think about the teachers and teachers unions, and we think about management, educational leaders, then we have the community. And that's where I want to spend some time on here, because we have single moms who might not have the opportunity to go to every single parent meeting, not have that support network at home, health issues or whatever have you, and they can't give that extra time that they want to give to their children and out of the school type learning. What are some of the things that they can do that practical yet effective in being a part of this change? Because I definitely feel that our communities have to step up, even though it's a challenge because of some of the plights they're in, to really engage in these levels. Because while the unions are duking it out or playing politics with management and vice versa, families are hurting. Families and children are, being gypped of a lot of important things. And again, this is just again over and over again, especially for great cities like Philadelphia. There's so much potential here. The migration of young professionals, the tech boom, all these different things. It's a perfect storm for a lot of great things to happen. How can the communities and families really just get on the heels and put a light of fire under their butts, and unions and management, to kind of jumpstart some of this progress that we need?
So there's some interesting efforts happening in Philadelphia right now. You mentioned the migration of more young professionals into the city, where young professionals are organizing around their local schools even before they have kids in those schools. An example, one of those organizations is Friends of Chester Arthur, but I was going to say, actually today there's a neighborhood summit. I just realized it's today, which won't be today for those that are watching the video, obviously. But today there's a neighborhood summit that's being organized by all of these local organizations across the city that are working collaboratively with their local school. So there is effort. Philly is a city of neighborhoods, so I think it's something that we can really capitalize on, and there is a lot of even in under-resourced communities, there's some community pride and community organizations there. And so the challenge is this group has brought together those that are already a little bit more established to come and learn from each other and talk about efforts that they're using to support their neighborhood schools. So that might look like helping apply for grants, or getting a neighborhood playground built, or providing resources when the school district hasn't had certain resources for schools. So there's some groups that are already established. They're coming together, and like I said, it's happening. There's a meeting today, but that's something that's sort of been continuously happening, which is really exciting to see community stepping up and really supporting schools. The challenge is, as you might imagine, that the neighborhoods that are more equipped to do that are the neighborhoods with more resourced families. So it's easier for parents in certain communities or community members that have access. They know the grants that are available. They might be able to do a fundraiser on their own. They may be able to put some of their own personal capital into the schools. That's not the majority. Well, it'd be interesting to sort of do a map and see like what neighborhoods this exists in. But I'd argue it's not the majority of neighborhoods in Philly. That doesn't mean that I don't think parents and community play an absolutely critical role in all neighborhoods. But the challenge is thinking about what does that look like in other neighborhoods, and what can we learn from other neighborhoods that are farther down the road in that. And I think a couple of things. I think simply just being present at the school is, while it may sound very small, really helps to create a community in the school. So it's going to the school, it's meeting the teachers, it's volunteering, it's getting engaged. And schools also need to do a better job of providing trainings and meetings and information for parents on how they can get involved and what they can be doing at home. And then I think that's sort of parents, but I think it's at the community level. What are the assets in a particular community? Are there businesses in the community, or are there churches in the community, or are there interesting sort of small networks? It doesn't have to be
a whole other nonprofit.
No, but I think every community has resources in Philadelphia, unique resources or unique assets, and how can we map what those assets are in a neighborhood and find the ways to bring whatever those assets are to the local school. So that's sort of at a neighborhood level. I also think with the city, either the city or the school district, depending on, I think both could help with this. They can do a better job of connecting. So for communities that perhaps aren't as well resourced, they can do a better job of connecting other organizations in the city to the needs of a particular school. District has an Office of Strategic Partnerships, which launched a couple of years ago, and that's part of their vision, is to say we need to identify... Districts? Office of Strategic Partnership, Philadelphia, I'm sorry. Philadelphia School District has this Office of Strategic Partnerships, and they've said we need to identify what the needs of the local schools are, and then we need to bring the not neighborhood community, but broader community resources to bear in those schools. So maybe we need to identify what businesses in Philadelphia could support that school, what nonprofits exist that are doing work in after-school care or whatever it is that that school needs. And we need to connect those broader community resources to a specific neighborhood. So I think there's neighborhood-based change, like of the residents in that local community, but also citywide, the question in places like Philadelphia and other communities, how are you connecting the resources that exist to support what the local school community needs?
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is the community organizing has to be done and kind of connect the dots with the particular needs.
And I just say one more thing.
Sure.
Sorry to go on this for a minute longer. Every region is different, but Philadelphia as a region has more nonprofits. We looked this up. More nonprofits serving education and youth than like any other metropolitan area. There is no shortage of incredible work happening in this city, but it's often happening in silos, or it's happening in one community and not in another community, right? So it's like, I don't think we have, and I don't mean to suggest we don't need more resources. We certainly do. We need more funding.
We need more resources. We don't need more nonprofits who are trying to solve the problem.
Yeah, we need those nonprofits. Yeah. We need one of two things to happen. We need those nonprofits to work better together, or we need this city, again, it could be the district, the city, someone to say, what do our schools need? What's the map of all of these organizations out there that do, anything from like basketball with high school youth to like, debate with middle school kids. I mean, there's so many resources. Yeah. How do we then identify what the schools need and appropriately match the nonprofits and services to those needs? Because there's a lot of duplication of efforts in Philly, and there's also a lot of, I think, missed opportunities to really maximize and leverage the impact of the work. So I believe that Philly has, a lot of times we talk about like deficit. I actually think Philly has tremendous assets to be able to bring to bear on the issues, and we just don't do a very good job of that.
Yeah, and the reason why I kind of like looked at John real quick is because it's a freaking pattern. Every time we interview someone, there's just like there's silos, there's duplication of efforts, there's all these missing pieces, and it's like the ingredients are always there, but no one knows what to do with the recipe. No one wants to agree on the recipe, man, and everybody wants to be the chef in the kitchen, and no one wants to kind of play their role. And that's a huge problem that we find. We're in our own world. Also,
so I will say something on that, which is that, my day job is I work as an education researcher at Penn, but my sort of night job, or whatever you would call it.
Your crime fighting job.
My other job, the late night hours, is a group of us, and it's not just me, a group of us founded an organization called Philly Core Leaders. Yeah, remember. Core stands for Coalition of Rising Education Leaders. And we founded this organization in response to a couple of issues, one of which we just discussed, which was the fragmentation of the education community. We all saw this incredible work happening in pockets across the city, but not coming together in ways that would really leverage the impact. And the other thing, which we've talked a little bit about, that we formed this group in response to, was the polarization in the dialogue. Yeah. You either had to be here. Yeah. You're like staunch reformer, anti-union, destroy the school system, or you had to be a traditional advocate that like thought the union was the most amazing thing ever and thought,
can do no wrong,
whatever, and that like nothing was wrong, or which is no one thinks that there doesn't need to be some sort of change. So you were forced into, or you are forced into, in Philadelphia education, oftentimes a camp. The reform camp has a name. The other camp doesn't really have a name, but it's sort of more traditional, maybe advocate community in Philadelphia, and we thought that was really unfortunate. So we founded CORE, and we have 100 members that range from teacher leaders, parent leaders, nonprofit leaders, business leaders, all the key stakeholders that run that spectrum. Some are close. I don't want to say anyone's in, because no one really wants to be in an extreme camp, but they run the spectrum of perspectives, and we create a space, a collaborative and positive space for those individuals to come together on a monthly basis to discuss issues, to share best practices, to talk about the innovation that is happening. And, our long-term vision, it's not a short-term vision. There's things we might do in 2 to 3 years to be able to measure our impact. But our 20-year vision is that if you have members of this group that are run that spectrum, that get to know each other on a personal level, that build relationships, work together over time where they do agree, that in 20 years we'll have a very different, and hopefully sooner, I just threw 20 years out there because it's a good sort of round number, but we'll have a different kind of education community where people might have different opinions, but they're willing to come to the table to actually talk about how they can work together to achieve a common end.
Yeah.
So core, I could go on about fragmentation, but we are trying in the education space to find ways to connect people to, at the basic level, get at the duplication of efforts issue, but at a much more macro level, find ways to really bring people together around a common agenda over time.
Well, in the panel that I originally met you in you said something that was pretty much flat out, I agree, was education is probably the most important thing that we need to really transform communities and the country overall. And it's amazing how simple that statement is, but yet profound. Because when we even discuss about educating one another about these things, people go in these really extremes in what they feel. So that's why I put a star next to the relationship thing, because it's amazing that despite how much we know, despite how much that we're in an information age, we forget that we're dealing with human beings. And when we're trying to come up with solutions, there's a lot of ego, there's a lot of pride, there's a lot of politics. Some people are trying to make a buck off these issues, and speaking everywhere and yet doing nothing, writing books yet doing nothing. And so that's why I really love to learn more about CORE. And how do you become a member at CORE, and we'll go from there. What's the membership requirements for CORE?
So we look for 3 commitments. We say we want you to have a commitment to education and youth services. People can show their commitment in different ways. So they might be a teacher or a leader. They might work for a nonprofit, but we want people that have some connection. It's not simply just like education seems interesting to me. We want people that have put some stake into the issues. They have that commitment, the demonstrated commitment to education or youth services. If you're a parent, that's a way to, have a commitment as well. So it doesn't have to just be your day job, is what I'm saying. Yeah. The second commitment is to Philadelphia. So I shared before, like with superintendents that have come and gone in 3 years. Same thing with the broader education community. There have been people that have come and gone. We're looking for people that are committed to Philadelphia. Now, you can't predict the future, so some of our members will leave Philadelphia, but we want people that at least can say right now that this is the area that they want to commit to. They see themselves being here in 20 years working on these issues, because those are the kind of leaders that are going to really benefit from the relationships. And then the final commitment we look for is a commitment to relationship building and collaboration. And so some people like being in the camps. Some people like getting to be, angry and loud and having, ego and what. I won't go into any details or stories on, but some people like that. That's their personality. That's their theory of change. You push harder. You are more aggressive. You double down. That's ultimately what leads to success. We aren't looking, and there's people on both sides of the aisle that have that kind of approach. We're looking for people that that believe that the way you get things done is through collaboration and relationship building. So that's a hard thing to necessarily screen for, but we do ask people to at least talk about their demonstrated commitment to, to listening, to being collaborative, to being focused on outcomes, to being committed to finding common ground. Like that's the kind of individual that we're looking to recruit. So you can apply. We have an annual membership cycle. We are not intending to be exclusive, so we accept anybody and everybody that meets those 3 commitments, because we want to grow the number of people in our membership so that we're really reaching out into as many different facets of the education space as we can. So you apply online. It's a relatively straightforward application, and then we have an annual membership which people can runs the school year, which people can renew depending on their sort of continued interest.
Again, I want to zero in on that relationship piece, because I think it's one of the biggest missed opportunities. I'm working with the Alumni Association for the Education Opportunity Fund, and one of our key things is relationship building. Because on one hand, we want to serve alumni, I'm one myself, and at the same time, when it comes to solving issues that some of them are problems that the higher ed is facing.
Mm-hmm.
We want to be able to activate those alumni and mobilize them for advocacy or whatever, what have you. And you can't do that without relationship. And I think that's something that I want to zero in on is there a structure that you're putting in place or that you're entertaining that allows you to create those pockets of relationships in a, not to borrow from our earlier conversation, but like in an autonomous way, yet structured way? Because there's something that I want to share with you and get your thoughts on that I think you might heard of or might be interested in, but want to get your takes. Is there like a...
And I'm glad you connected it back to the earlier conversation, because motivational theory would say you're motivated by three things. Yeah. Autonomy, mastery, so that's, we haven't talked as much about that, but that's feeling successful, basically, and seeing an impact, which is why I say quick wins is really important. And then relatedness. Like human beings are driven by the need for relationship. Even your most introverted folks are still like have that relatedness need. It just may look a little different. So I absolutely think that it, like, Philly in particular, anywhere, but motivational would say anywhere relationships are really important. In a place like Philly, where everyone says it's a big, small town and everyone's disconnected by one person, the quality of your relationships is incredibly important. And this, like, not just the surface level, but the depth of those relationships. So we are constantly working on and thinking about what it looks like to really create a structure that allows you to build relationships. One thing I will say is that we don't try to force it. And so it's like, yes, there are sort of like, you could read a book on how to build relationships, but then it's like you're almost kind of in some ways forcing the issue, when what it takes to really build a relationship is allowing the space for authentic connections to form. So we have monthly meetings as our group, and each monthly meeting is focused on a different issue in Philly education. We also allow a space at every monthly meeting for relationship building. Sometimes it's more structured than others, certain icebreakers or activities that you can do, and sometimes it's less structured, and it's just providing the space for people to come together. And I'd say not just like networking, but like people that are like-minded, that are around an issue, that just to be in the same room and to learn from each other. So we do structured, a little more structured relationship building at all of our meetings. But then just the way that we facilitate conversations around issues, I also think helps people to deepen their relationships. So say we did something on charters, which we have in the past. We wouldn't just bring in people that are pro-charter. We would bring in people that are pro-charter, people that are anti-charter, parents that are wrestling with the decision about charters, teachers that have taught in charters and not in charters, and have a really deep conversation about the issue. And I think that allows the to activate relationships, because it's not surface level. You hear somebody say something that you really are interested in, and so you have a space then to build a more authentic relationship with them. So it's hard work. Very hard. And it takes time, particularly when people are really busy. So people will come or not come, and it takes time to really figure out how you build relationships. But within CORE, I would certainly say that there's a core within CORE, if you will, of folks that have been committed since we founded the organization, that now have much stronger relationships with each other than when they started, which is exciting to see. Hard to measure, but exciting to see.
Well, I was talking to a pastor in Harlem. I helped start a church in Harlem that's very progressive, socially conscious, and we were talking about that. And for a long time, I had a big gripe about conversations and networking, right? And it's like, oh, hey, now what? And I want our audience members to really understand this. This is huge. You can't activate a community, or you can't mobilize communities or individuals from various parts of your town or your city or whatever it is, even your block, unless there's relationship, period. You can't do that. And doing that takes time. My problem is when it stays there, when it's all about that, scratching that intellectual itch and going back and forth. There's something that I thought was really powerful that I saw on this thing called anchor institutions. Have you heard of that?
I don't. Tell me more. I don't think so. Nothing's coming to mind.
I'm asking a lot of people about that, and most people haven't heard about anchor institutions. And basically, it's really trying to, all right, you map a community. Someone's really kind of like taking the front on the community building piece, community organizing piece, feeling the needs. Then you have the anchor institution of, like, most of the time it's a higher ed institution, and they're a great place for hosting things because of the structural resources, the capital, and the expertise that are found in a higher ed setting. Then you have the pieces of the economy, small business, big business, and what's their role in creating a vibrant community, and education, hospitals, that kind of thing. And so by having that community piece and having someone almost at a macro level kind of see all these moving pieces, when it comes to a bill that comes up or some type of legislation that has a great impact, it's way more easier to diffuse that information and have them to mobilize based on that. It's happening in, I think, Detroit, where they're really trying to rebound with what's happened there in our economy. And they did, there was a firm that was working with Temple on this too, where they're really trying to kind of crack that code of how do you take these silos and bring them together.
That's really interesting. I do think higher ed could have a really important role to play in that.
Yeah, to like, hey, everyone, like, because number one, they have a vested interest, because with if their community around them starts to fall apart, it's just really going to be detrimental for them in the long term.
I think you've seen some of that in Philadelphia around Penn and Drexel, like in their immediate community. So Drexel, I know, has done a lot of work around the Promise Zone initiative. To bring together resources, but it maybe I haven't seen it or thought about it as a citywide effort, but I think I have always said that's part of the reason that I'm still in higher ed is I think higher ed has a really important role to play, and to your point, can bring together a lot of knowledge and resources to bear on issues, and so I think it's really interesting. One thing I'll say about Philly Core Leaders, again, that what you said really resonated with me as well, is this not just networking for networking's sake. So when we brought together the first group of core members, it was a very organically formed group. We would leave meetings frustrated and go get coffee, and then the group started getting bigger and bigger.
That's a real meeting sometimes.
That's exactly. Let's go have the meeting after the meeting.
Yeah.
So that's how the group formed, and that group just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And we thought maybe we should form an organization and not just have our friends and inner circle sort of be in it, but actually broaden it out and invite others into the space. But one of the things that people consistently said at those meetings was, we don't just want to be a group that talks and networks. We want to be a group that our phrase is GSD, get shit done. If you haven't heard that, right? Like a group that rolls up their sleeves. And so we recruit members that's their mindset too. Now, Core does things. We have committees. We have an engagement committee, an innovation committee, and a policy committee. So our engagement committee really works on connecting members to other members' work and helping us support each other rather than sort of the duplication of efforts. Our innovation committee runs an annual event called SEED, Supporting Entrepreneurship and Education, crowd-funded event for educational entrepreneurs and teachers, where we give away a $5,000 prize to seed a new innovative idea, hence the name SEED. And then our policy committee hosts 3 to 4 events a year that address different policy issues in Philadelphia to widen our impact beyond just our individual membership. This coming spring, we're doing an event on what is the mayor and council's role in education. Not just what are their approaches, like what can they actually do, because there's a lot of misinformation out there about that. So we are certainly a group that does things also, and I think part of what helps to deepen the relationships in the group is that people are actually doing work together. So even if that work's not advocacy based, which it's not, because we pull from people that have very different opinions on issues, so it would be hard to do
that's going to be
advocacy. But it's work. It's substantive work. And so you bring people together that might have different perspectives on an issue, but you give them a common project or challenge to address together. I think that helps to deepen relationships as well.
Yeah, I agree. And it's so awesome to hear that, because a lot of these organizations at a local level, they do have that. They stay on conversation. They stay in that, and they have so much potential. And the reason why I kind of harp on that sometimes a little too much, is it's tough love. I don't know about you, but I vision when you talk about social change, which ultimately is what we're all talking about, right? Historically speaking, that stuff comes from the bottom up. It rarely comes from the top down. So which is why it's more important than ever for these nonprofits to really connect the dots and really start working together. Talking to Jeffrey Canada about that, he said a lot of times the funding models don't really lend itself to collaborative partnerships, and that's a very sad thing. But taking from what you do at CORE, for example, you have to get connected to what's already there, and if there's nothing there, try to point the resources together to do that. So people who are listening in, if there's an organization, especially in the tri-state area, if you want to start your own version of CORE, that might be something they can talk to you about. What's some of the things that, I'm kind of volunteering you a little bit.
No, well, I should say we actually have a group that's formed called DelaCore for Delaware.
Oh, there you go.
So that definitely, we actually are interested in thinking about what could this kind of model look like in other places. DelaCore is still in its infant stages, but one of our members that was a member of Philly Core lived in Wilmington, and she thought, I want to bring this kind of work around bringing people together in Delaware, which it's a state, but it's essentially a small state, so that you can really think about doing something at a state level. Yeah,
and I know PanVisio, I would love to even see how we can assist with helping you make it a platform. Because again, Philly's not the same thing as these other places.
No, it needs to look different because it needs to be. So we say we have the core essentials. I think that each community needs to determine how to approach the work that will fit within their context, but there are things about CORE that are really essential, that we take a more positive and proactive approach, that we are committed to relationship building, that we're committed to sharing diverse perspectives on issues and creating a space for really productive dialogue that gets at the core of the issue, right? The name has lots of puns you can make off of it. But there's certain things that are really core to core that are about the work, and then there are other things that are going to look very different in different areas that would try to start a similar effort. Okay,
and to wrap things up, in lieu of CORE, what are some organizations that parents and people can get involved with that can help move the needle? And I think the professional unionism that you're talking about. Are there organizations they can join, be part of, that can really help move that needle?
Oh, interesting. I don't know of organizations on the professional unionism front besides the one I already mentioned, which is TURN, which is more targeted at union leadership. I will say that I think about the ways to get involved in education at different levels. So there's a school or classroom-based way to get involved. And so the groups I mentioned, like Friends of Chester Arthur in Philadelphia, that are springing up around local neighborhood schools, I think that they exist in lots of school districts. You might have to be a parent to be a part of some of those organizations, but not necessarily. So my first recommendation to people is always look at what's happening at your local school and try to see, is there an effort already underway? If there isn't an effort underway, there's a model that other communities have started efforts that you could create a local effort to get parents and community members more engaged in schools. And then there is, as we noted, plenty of nonprofits doing really pretty incredible work around a range of issues in Philadelphia, and not just Philadelphia, but other communities as well in the area around volunteer type work. So you can be a debate coach, or you can, I could go on for
even
hours.
After school programs.
Programs, yeah. So one of the challenges in a place like Philly Education is that people haven't done a particularly good job of mapping those organizations. But if you go to Philly Core Leaders website, phillycoreleaders.com, we have members that are parts of different organizations. There's generosity.org in Philly where there's lists of different organizations. But it's finding your niche. If you want to get involved more on a volunteering side, there's a whole range of different opportunities. And then there's the more policy and advocacy type organizations to get involved in. And there are a lot of those as well. Some of them, actually most of them probably live a little bit closer to one of the camps that I mentioned because they are doing more advocacy around policies. In Philadelphia, there's PCCY, which is an organization that does a lot of statewide efforts around funding advocacy and other things. And then on sort of I hate putting people in camps, but there's other groups that are a little more reform-oriented, like the Philadelphia School Partnership or PenCan, that are in the Philadelphia community that are doing more advocacy on sort of charters and other types of issues. So there is no shortage of places at the school level to get involved, at the nonprofit level to get involved, and at the policy and advocacy level. There's a range of organizations doing very different types of advocacy work depending on people's interests, but plenty of ways to get engaged and plugged in.
Yeah, and it is not going to happen overnight, obviously, but for our audience members, I agree with you that education is key to any type of transformation, and being relational in that regard is super important. I heard if in the classroom setting, if they don't know that you care, they're not going to tune in. And just the same is true for children in the classroom. Unless people who are in power really know that we care, they're not going to really, move as urgently as we would like them to see them move. So definitely get involved in those issues and check out CORE. Was it Philly Core Leader? Core.com?
PhillyCoreLeaders.com.
PhillyCoreLeaders.com. Check that out. I think we're ended there. It would be great to see you as you kind of continue to do your research and your findings. We'd love to have you again, just kind of give people an update on what's new and hip and happening in the education sector and see what's working. Because again, we're always looking for what's working and how we can deconstruct that. So thanks so much for your time and your generosity having us. And we'll link a lot of these things in the show notes. So we'll end it here, and thanks so much.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. See you.